Let me just indulge me for a couple of minutes, and I'm going to give you a bit of a framing for this series, which we will not have to spend time on in future sessions, but I want to kind of explain to you the rationale of why we're here. The first thing is that you'll notice the format here. This series of discussions is going to be different from most of the energy seminars that many of you are used to coming and listening to. Structurally, we're not going to have any slides, no PowerPoints. They're going to be all discussions like this. And thematically, these discussions are going to be less about the intricacies of science and more about the vagaries of finance and policy. To be clear, we're absolutely going to dig into technical questions about the viability of a range of technologies in China. But really what we want to do here over the next 6 or so weeks is follow the money. The goal is to assess where capital is moving in the effort to scale up cleaner energy in China, which, as you obviously know, is the most populous, the most energy consuming, and the most carbon emitting country on the planet. So the basic premise of these discussions is going to be pretty simple. What China does on energy over the next couple of decades matters arguably more to the global energy markets and to the global environment than what any other country, including notably the United States, does. As you know, China has surpassed the US as the world's largest carbon emitter and the world's largest energy consumer, and the trajectory is only up, as David, I'm sure, will tell us more about. Moreover, what China does on energy has huge implications for US strategy in the globalizing clean energy industry going forward. That clean energy industry is getting more competitive, more cutthroat by the day. 2 other quick points by way of introduction. It seems to me that the relationship between the US and China in energy technologies is pretty widely caricatured and misunderstood. It's generally seen as a pretty black and white scenario, a kind of zero-sum game in which either the US wins or China wins. End of story. And what I hope we'll do over the next few weeks is to explain the complexity that's really at play here. That is that the relationship between the US and China is more nuanced and increasingly interdependent. In a sense, what we're going to try to look at here is whether there's a relationship and to what extent on the ground a relationship is developing that's based on mutual economic self-interest. That by working together, as we will discuss today, at least on some things, both the US and China win. Now, I pointedly do not want to be Pollyanna here. We're not here to suggest that everything is hunky-dory. These are 2 massive countries that are at loggerheads on a lot of issues, and the nastiness is at least as loud as the friendliness. But I want us to plumb here what the future may look like in terms of this interdependence. Lastly, the last point I want to make is that what China is and isn't doing on energy within its own borders is, I think, often caricatured and misunderstood. Let me just, to start the juices flowing, posit one thing. I think in this country, in the US, one sort of side of the political spectrum paints China as a country that's adopting extraordinarily progressive environmental laws with the benefit, in this side's view, of a very activist central government. And if only the US could ape what China is doing, the US and the world would be better off. On the other side, in the US, there's a view that China is violating international trade rules and essentially unfairly competing with the United States and Europe. So again, I hope that we will kind of get through that polarized bluster in these discussions. So we're going to discuss a whole range of issues over the next several weeks, starting today with coal. And I will stop yakking in 1 minute, but I just want to frame why David's here and why David's perhaps the best person to be here on this. US energy demand is flat. China's energy demand is rising fast. In the US, coal accounts for about 46% of electricity generation. In China, coal accounts for about 80% of electricity generation. Virtually all of the growth in global energy demand is expected to come not from the US, not from the Western world, but from developing countries. And virtually all of the growth in global coal use is expected to come over the next several decades from China and India. So that lays the picture here. We have here David Mohler, who's the Chief Technology Officer for Duke Energy. Duke, for those of you who don't know it, is the largest power company in the United States. Duke has a market cap of about $45 billion. Duke's based in Charlotte, North Carolina, and operates in the Southeast and also in a bit of the Midwest. Duke has become heavily involved over the last 5 years or so in China. David has become a China hand. I think David will tell you he's traveled about 20 times to China over the past few years. David speaks some Chinese. David's going to spend the better part of June in China. And I'm going to stop now, but I just want to turn it over to David. And I guess the first question is a question that I've heard students here ask all day today. And that is, we are sitting here in Silicon Valley where the buzz is all about new technologies. So I guess what I'm curious about is why coal?
A couple of reasons. Is this on? Can you hear me?
I think.
Okay. Okay, it's a matter of placement.
There you go. There you go. Yeah, that's good.
Better? Yeah. Okay, good. A couple of reasons. One is one you alluded to, which is, you know, in the U.S., if we shut down all the coal today, it's not going to have it's not going to have any impact, let me be blunt, on global climate. And we are interested in playing a part in global climate mitigation, shall we say. So we think that from a technology perspective and from a business perspective, we need to keep our head in that game. Secondly, if you look at, let me throw out some numbers. If we want to reduce the carbon emissions globally today by 2 gigatons, a couple of different alternatives to do that. One is we need to build 195 times as much solar capacity as is in place today, and that's not 195%, that's 195 times, so almost 200 times. Or, alternatively, we could increase the average efficiency of the existing coal-powered fleet in the world from 34% to 40%. So that just tells you a little bit of kind of the magnitude of the problem and the trade-off between the technologies. So I guess I'm going to keep going beyond two reasons, but another reason is we have huge resources in coal in North America, and as there are huge resources in Asia. So at some point, and in some way, we have to think about, are those resources worth attempting to utilize for energy security, for whatever reason, for economics, for whatever reason. So a number of reasons there that I think you know, make me very interested in continuing to understand the evolution of coal technology. But the real answer that I would give on a personal level, not speaking for Duke Energy, is because I'm concerned about climate change. And because I think that if we don't continue to figure out the technologies that will be able to utilize the fuels that are going to be utilized globally, whether we utilize them in the US or not, we're not addressing the problem.
So talk a little bit more about how you see the map of potential for cleaner ways to burn coal. That is the map for money going into coal technologies around the world. So contrast the US with China. What's going on in the US, what's going on in China?
Well, one thing that's going on in China that's not going on in the U.S. is there's a continued build-out of new generating capacity, most of it coal. And in the process of doing that, the technologies that are being deployed are increasing in efficiency and decreasing in carbon intensity. So a lot of supercritical plants are being built, a lot of ultra-supercritical plants are being built.
So just define supercritical and ultra-supercritical.
Well, in the broadest terms, if you look at traditional pulverized coal technology, it has efficiencies of maybe 30%, low 30s. So as you increase temperatures and pressures, you increase the efficiency of the plant. So fundamentally, that's it. So supercritical and ultra-supercritical are incrementally more efficient than simple pulverized coal. So that is kind of a way of being able to continue to grow energy supply while reducing the carbon intensity of that supply. Not a perfect solution, but incremental progress being made. Also in China, there is significant work that's continuing on carbon capture and sequestration technology. And in the US, to contrast with that a little bit, the work on carbon capture and sequestration technology has essentially come to a standstill from my perspective. I think because I know from my own perspective because I cannot economically justify it. So if I want to go to my CFO or my board and say, hey, we need X million dollars over the next few years to develop these technologies, the immediate pushback is, why would we do that? We're just pouring money down a rat hole. There's no mechanism of recovery. For recovery, there's no price on carbon, so why should we do that kind of work?
So this is actually a good place, I think, to put a marker down here. So before coming to Stanford, I was a reporter, a newspaper reporter, writing about energy for a long time, and I came into contact with Jim Rogers, who's the CEO of Duke, who over the years has been very, very vocal in the energy and climate debate in the U.S. And in fact, Jim Rogers was talking about his perception of the need for carbon regulation in the U.S. over the past 5 or 10 years. So at some point, Duke, like other energy companies, was factoring an assumption of a price on carbon in the United States into its capital planning decisions. That is, when you guys decided what you were going to build, you factored a carbon price in. Are you still doing that?
Yeah, well, the way we were factoring it in was we were essentially running scenarios. So, here's what it looks like without a carbon price. Here's what it looks like with the carbon price of X, carbon price of Y. What's our risk tolerance given those kinds of expectations, together with when we think some kind of carbon legislation is likely to be enacted. We still do the scenarios, but we do not explicitly think that carbon legislation is likely to be enacted anytime soon in the form that we thought it was going to be. So we see EPA looking at ways to increase regulation around carbon, some of which may be productive, but it's very, very unclear to us, what a pricing regime is going to look like.
We're going to get into China in a second, but before we go to China, I just want to stay in the U.S. for one other second. Walk us through what the array of technologies is that Duke has looked at over the past several years with an eye toward cleaning up the combustion of carbon.
Well, we've done a couple of things on the coal side, and then I'll talk to it across the portfolio. So on the coal side, we've built a large integrated gasification combined cycle plant that is actually capture and sequestration ready, and that plant's in Indiana. It's a 618 megawatt plant, the largest of its kind, and that technology is also very much more efficient than traditional coal technology. It actually emits CO2 at about the rate of a gas-fired power plant, which is basically half traditional coal-fired power plant. We also as we've done that, we've retired, in this case, I believe 168 megawatts of old coal-fired plant that was on site. The new plant, which is 618 megawatts, will actually emit less CO2 than the old 138 megawatt plant. So that's one thing we've done. We've also built a supercritical power plant in North Carolina. It's an 835 megawatt plant, and we have retired, I believe 800 megawatts of older coal to offset that. So once again, the supercritical plant's much more efficient, emits much less CO2 per unit energy produced. Done those two things on the coal side. We've built 3 new gas plants, have 2 more that will be commissioned this year that will allow us to retire an additional 3,800 megawatts or so of older coal plant. So once again, cutting the CO2 in half. And in the last, I guess at this point, about 2 years, we've gone from 0 wind resources in North America to 1,650 megawatts today of wind, and gone from very minor, I think on the order of a couple of megawatts of solar in the U.S. to 162 megawatts today.
So you talked about this plant, this 618 megawatt plant. This is the Edwardsport plant,
That's the Edwardsport
right?
plant.
So I'm going to ask an inelegant question before we go across the Pacific to China, and that is this plant has experienced lots of problems, right? Lots of delays, big cost overruns, a good chunk of which Duke customers are going to eat. Explain to us what's gone on with a bit of specificity and what that says about the trajectory of this technology going forward.
Well, I still believe this is a very promising technology. And our perspective back when we were first thinking about building the plant was that we have prior experience in a syngas facility in Wabash, Indiana. Much smaller scale, like a fraction of the scale of our Edwardsport plant. But we believe that we understood enough about the technology to be able to scale it appropriately. And our vendors who provided the fundamental technology also believe that to be the case. One of them, GE, had built a plant in Florida also of significantly smaller scale. So we thought we understood enough about it to scale it. As it turns out, the problems in scaling were significantly greater than we anticipated. And those problems just arise from let me back up for just a minute. I mean, Edwardsport really is serial number 1 of a plant of its kind and size. So if you haven't done it yet, you really don't know what you're going to run into in the real world. And some of it's really simple stuff, but you just can't anticipate it. It's like if you put this piece of equipment next to that piece of equipment, this bizarre thing happens where the communications and controls interfere with each other. So therefore, you've either got to redesign them or you got to separate the equipment or whatever. Those problems in scaling were, I think, the hub of the matter, and they were compounded by contractual issues. So the technology was provided by General Electric for Edwardsport. The plant was constructed by Bechtel, and they went into those contracts with a certain set of assumptions. So when those assumptions were not realized during construction, then you've got contractual issues to resolve. Well, who pays for that? Who's responsible for that? Who fixes that? All that kind of stuff. So those were clearly factors in making it more difficult, as were just some other kind of, almost gratuitous kinds of things. Like when we began construction, we had some very abnormally cold and wet weather. Well, it's tough to pour concrete if it's below 32 degrees Fahrenheit and if you've got a foot of water on the plant site. So that delayed the schedule. So delaying the schedule increases the finance cost. So these things kind of begin to snowball a little bit.
Okay, that's very helpful. So let's now jump over the Pacific to China. So walk us back to about 2008, right?
Okay.
Which is when
You want the whole story?
I want the whole story.
Okay.
I want the whole story in 4 minutes.
4 minutes.
I mean, why did you guys decide to go there? How did you decide to go there? And then we'll sort of play this out and figure out what's been going on while you're there.
Okay, well, I'm going to try to stay to 4 minutes, but I'm going to back up to 2004.
Okay.
So 2004, I led a major capital allocation review for what then was one of the predecessor companies to what today is Duke Energy. And what we determined...
Synergy. That company was Synergy.
That's right. What we determined was that capital had not been allocated in a way that you would desire if you looked prospectively instead of retrospectively. So what we understood at that point was that we were going to have to put significant money not only into distribution assets, but into power plants. When we looked at the fleet at that point, and we updated this study in 2007, we began to realize that we were going to have to replace every single one of our generating stations then in operation between that time and 2050. And for people outside the power, for Silicon Valley people, that sounds like a long time, 2007 to 2050. In the electric utility business, that is not a long time. What that means is that in 2007, you've got to make decisions about plants that may not start construction until 2012, 2015, and then once built, will have 40, 50, or 60-year lives. So we began to wonder, how do we pick the right technologies, the best technologies, when we don't really have a lot of current data here on what's going to be developed or what is even developing? So that started us really literally looking around the world for where is technology development being implemented and brought to scale and commercialized, where we can learn, where we can do a little due diligence and really figure out what's going to be the best selections for Duke. And if you remember 2008, that was also when the capital markets were having some significant problems. So at Duke at the time, we couldn't even consistently get commercial paper. So we looked at the financial markets kind of locking down a little bit. We looked at the huge capital that was going to be required to essentially replace the generation fleet over the next couple of decades. And we began to think, we better figure out how to gain more access to diverse sources of capital, or we could be in a real squeeze here. So Jim Rogers, who you mentioned, has a grandson who graduated from high school in the spring of 2008. And Jim said, hey, as a graduation present, I'll take you any place in the world you want to go. So Alex, his grandson, said, I've always wanted to go to China. So Jim took Alex to China, and they looked all around the country. And some of you, I have to imagine, are from China. Some of you have probably been. But everybody I've taken over with me, as I've gone the last 5 years or whatever it's been, and this happened to me too. So the afternoon of the second day, when you're kind of there and the jet lag's worn off a little bit, you kind of look around and you go, oh my God, right? The scale of this place and what's going on is just astounding, kind of in its breadth and its scope. So long story short, Jim gave me the assignment, even though I didn't speak the language and didn't know anybody in China at the time, to go over and try to do those first two things, which was to figure out if there were relationships we could form that would allow us to really learn about technologies being commercialized and deployed at scale so that we could bring them to the Americas for the benefit of our customers quicker, cheaper, and with lower risk than we could if we just tried to do it by ourselves. And in the course of those conversations, to try to see if there was some kind of a pathway where we could begin to gain access to Chinese sources of capital. So that was really what kicked it off.
To gain access to Chinese capital that you could then deploy in the U.S. because you were finding it difficult to get capital in the U.S.
We wanted a backstop. Basically, we wanted other sources of capital. Yeah.
So we're going to fast forward a little bit, and you found your way actually to a whole panoply of companies doing different technologies in China. But one of them was and is Huaneng, the largest power company in China, a power company that has essentially almost 3 times the installed capacity as Duke, 2 to 3 times. So just to give you a sense of scale, Duke is the biggest power company in the U.S. Its partner in China is 2 to 3 times as large. Duke's growth is essentially flat year over year in capacity. Huaneng's capacity is growing at, what, 8% or so a year. Just a really interesting microcosm of these 2 different countries. So you get to China, we're going to fast forward, you do this deal with Huaneng, and explain to us the Huaneng technology, particularly the post-combustion carbon capture technology, why it was attractive.
So Huaneng has a post-combustion carbon capture technology that's been in place at their Gabeidian power plant in Beijing for, gosh, it was in operation when I first went, so that's been 2008 to now, or even prior to 2008. That's a very small pilot project, a slipstream from the flue gas of the power plant. They have a much larger one at Shidongku outside of Shanghai, another power plant of theirs. It's much larger. It captures 100,000 tons of CO2. It was designed to capture 100,000 tons of CO2 per year. They've actually managed to debottleneck it so it captures 120,000 a year, so 20% higher than design. And I was really intrigued when I went to see that project because 2 things really from a technical point of view. One is the footprint of that part of the plant is much, much smaller than I imagined it to be. And I imagined it to be larger based on work that we had done with other kinds of technologies that have much greater footprints. A lot of our power plants, when we try to think about how might we retrofit carbon capture onto an existing power plant, are very space constrained. So this was a huge consideration. The second huge consideration was the costs of post-combustion capture that we were familiar with before talking to Huaneng were on the order of $70 to $90 per ton. And when I talked to the chief engineer at Shidongku and asked what the cost was, the person told me $16 per ton. And I thought, well, I'm not sure I believe 16, but hell of a difference there, and I want to understand that. So we entered into a project with Huaneng under the U.S.-China Clean Energy Research Center that was established in 2009 by Presidents Obama and Hu, and involved, so it's a public-private partnership to do this kind of technology development. And we did a detailed engineering study of what it would take to actually deploy Huaneng's post-combustion capture technology to our Gibson Unit 3 power plant in Indiana. And that was a very, very valuable, worthwhile exercise. What we found was that the costs, capital costs, were incrementally better with their technology. Not only was the size of the equipment better for our needs, but the capital costs were on the order of 3 to 5% lower in the U.S. So this is all apples to apples in the U.S. now. O&M costs, depending on exactly how you configured things,
operations and maintenance costs.
Thank you. Could be between 3.5% and 7.5% lower, and the solvent that they use in the process has very superior regeneration capabilities, so that the energy penalty for the plant was also roughly 5% lower. So those sound and are marginal and incremental improvements, but they count.
Okay,
they really
so
do count.
let's just unpack this a second.
Okay.
So David's talking about this plant in Shanghai, which is the bigger of the 2 plants that Huaneng has this capture technology on. The numbers that David's talking about pencil out to about 4% of the flue gas coming out of this plant in Shanghai, this coal-fired power plant, is being captured. About 4% of the CO2 is being captured, which, according to Huaneng, qualifies just that 4% as the largest carbon capture project from a coal-fired power plant in the world. So I just want to, and I know that if Dr. Xu were here, we would ask him to give us a deep dive into the technology, but from your perspective, how is it that Huaneng is building a better mousetrap? What specifically is it? And more to the point, how did they manage to do it? If it's this absorber chemical, what was it about what Huaneng does that allowed Huaneng to come up with this when other companies all around the world are trying to figure this thing out?
I'm not party to their R&D process, so I'm not under the covers on that. But really, it does come down to the solvent that they use to strip the CO2 out of the flue gas. And it's just a very innovative chemical cocktail that has much better qualities than the monoethyl amines that are normally deployed.
To what extent is, once Huaneng had this chemical cocktail, to what extent are the lower costs of building things in China relevant here?
They're not. So they're not. So we did this really truly on the Gibson Unit 3 station and exactly what it would cost here. But the other cost savings that I alluded to are in fact a product of that superior solvent. So it's easier, takes less energy to regenerate, it takes less equipment. It's just a lot of cost savings based on the superior quality.
So you guys went into this thing thinking that you were going to deploy this at Gibson, predicated on an assumption of carbon regulation in the U.S.
No,
presumably?
at the point we went into this study, we were after the kind of realization that, gee, we're probably not going to have carbon legislation when we thought we were. But one of the reasons we continue to work with Chinese partners on this technology is we think that it's a matter of when. We think sooner or later we're going to do something about CO2 in this country. Don't know exactly what vehicle that'll take. And we want to keep an eye on that technology development so that when that does occur, we're ready for it. And we understand how to select the best technologies and move forward.
Any projections as to when that's going to happen in this country?
You have somebody in the audience who might be better at that than me. I don't know.
But to be clear, the feeling at Duke is not anytime soon enough to base investment decisions in any real way on that assumption.
Right. I would not succeed in going to our CFO today and asking for significant funds to invest in post-combustion capture.
Okay. So when you are in China, you're working with Huaneng. What is it like on a daily, weekly basis to work with this company, the largest power company in China, a state-owned company? Interestingly, it seems to me a company, what the situation is here is that an American company is obtaining technology from a Chinese company, which sort of flips what I think we would think of as the traditional relationship on its head. But what's it like just doing business in this deal?
Okay, so let me get to the what's it like doing business. I want to talk about the getting technology from China. So I have to really clarify this point a lot when I speak about this. But Duke Energy is not in the intellectual property business. So we're not like a Silicon Valley company. We buy intellectual property. We essentially buy, apply, and operate technologies. So the technology we're interested in is the technology of scale. How do you bring technologies to scale, and how do you operate technologies in the best possible way? So that makes us a little different from Silicon Valley companies, for example. So with that premise, that gives us a much kind of easier way to interact with Huaneng and other Chinese companies on a day-to-day basis, because there's not all that complication around, well, okay, how do we protect the IP and who's going to own it? And we're not interested in that. We're interested in how do we share operating practices, best practices, experiences, and learn from each other to improve operations on both sides of the Pacific. So much kind of cleaner and symmetrical value equation. Now, if you get to the kind of more qualitative what's it like to work, a couple of things. One is it's been really interesting, and the Gibson project, the post-combustion capture engineering study, I think really crystallized a lot of my answer to your question for me. Because when you try to work across cultures and across the Pacific and across the 12 to 13 hour time differential, it introduces a lot of friction, okay? You don't always communicate with each other. You think you understand each other and you don't. You're framing a problem in you think you've got one set of boundaries around a problem, and the other people think, no, it's really this set of boundaries. So it's just...
Can you give us an example of that?
Yeah, before we did the Gibson study, we thought the cost of that process was $16 a ton. It turns out to be significantly more than that.
How much?
Between a factor of 4.5 and 5.
Times 16.
Yeah.
Wow.
So not 16. And it really had a lot. It really
decidedly not 16.
In fact, when I first heard 16 from the engineer, I turned to him and said, 60? You mean 60? No, 16. Okay. But it had a lot to do with how we bounded that analysis.
Just for my feeble mind. So 4 times 16 is 64.
Right.
Compared to 70.
Yeah.
Right? So the relative benefit here is slightly different from 16 to 70.
Yeah.
Okay.
Which is what we want. That's why we did the Gibson study.
Got it. Okay.
But what the Gibson study did is it forced us to resolve those issues, to really roll up our sleeves and understand clearly how each party was thinking about the problem, bounding the problem, made us get in a room for a long period of time and make sure we were speaking the same language, understanding the things the same way. Big learning experience for me. So now I know the next time I'm going to do something like this, I got to spend that time and get that clear up front. Okay. So that's an issue. Another issue that I know you and I have talked about before is, so I've been over, I don't know, 25 times in the last 4.5 years. And I go over, I spend 2 weeks or even longer. Sometimes I take my guys over with me. We meet with our counterparts. We spend hours and hours in rooms with whiteboards and get projects defined and all kinds of stuff going. And I leave thinking the plates are spinning on top of the sticks, right? And then I come back here for a week and I call over there and the plates have all gone. So it's just hard to keep things going when you're trying to work at that kind of remove and across cultures, and it really requires a very high level a much higher level of engagement than I anticipated at first.
So we're gonna open this up to your questions in a few minutes, but I want to just cover a couple of other things before we do, and I want to talk about nuclear for a second. So you guys are also working with Huaneng on nuclear technology, and Huaneng is quite interested in Duke's expertise in nuclear, as you are in Huaneng's ability to scale certain nuclear technologies. Talk about what you're doing with nuclear.
Okay, well, Huaneng Power Group is currently building 2 small modular nuclear reactors in Shandong Province at Shidaobei. And behind that, they're planning to build 2 Westinghouse AP1000 large nuclear units. In the U.S., the last nuclear unit built here went into service in 1985. So while China has 4 in operation today, 4 nuclear units, and I think either 14 or 16 in the pipeline for the next year or so, and then behind that there's a drawing board that's got like 196 or something like that. So continuing to build. So where can we go to get, so we're planning on building some AP1000s that do, we think, maybe, a lot of ifs. But if we do, we want to understand what the experience is, what we can look forward to, what the real costs are. Because, you know, the vendor will tell you one cost, just like we learned at Edwardsport, and then when you go do it, you figure out, well, maybe it's not really that, right? So we're very interested in engaging with Huaneng. We actually have agreements with all the nuclear power operators in China, and we are working with all of them, actually. But the kind of the quid pro quo with Huaneng is we're interested in what I just described. They have not been a nuclear operator yet. So step 1 for them is they have to qualify with the Chinese government to be nuclear operators. In order to do that, they have to come to the table with a fundamental level of knowledge and qualification. So we've now had 5 teams of their engineers and a couple of teams of their senior managers who will be the nuclear team going forward, come train in our nuclear facilities in the Carolinas, and the executives and managers have actually lived with our nuclear management team to see how they manage a nuclear fleet and to see how we manage things like, for example, how do you manage a site that's got multiple reactors operating? That's another challenge that they haven't had to confront yet. So the quid pro quo with them is we can give them that training, that experience. We can show them what we are by far, by almost any measure, the superior nuclear operator in the U.S. today, by almost any measure. And so we can talk with them and show them what we think it takes to have that kind of excellent performance. And we can also work with them on a safety culture. And let me apologize in advance if I offend any sensibilities in the room. But my own experience in working with China and Japan at this point is that there is, you know, the whole idea of saving face is subtle and powerful. And so if a subordinate sees a problem, they can be very, very hesitant to go to the superior and say, hey, something's wrong here, or somebody didn't do something right, etc. And in a nuclear safety culture, that is deadly. You cannot do that. You can't ignore a problem. You've got to go identify it. And so we're also very interested in trying to transmit what we see as the keys to a nuclear safety culture, because frankly, if any nuclear problem occurs in a nuclear plant anywhere in the world, any nuclear operator's got a problem. There's going to be a public reaction and probably costs associated with anybody's.
So David, I want to ask you just from the standpoint of what Duke gets out of this deal. You guys are a company with a $45 billion market cap, give or take. What does it cost to build a new traditional nuclear power plant, conventional nuclear power plant?
12 to 14 billion.
So a third or a quarter of your market cap, right? So that's a big decision.
You bet.
So
bet the company decision.
A bet the company decision. So what is the technology that you're looking at? These small modular nuclear reactors cost what? Not 12 billion, but
Probably one, something like that.
Okay, so there's the economic motivation for
It depends on the size. So that particular technology is scalable all the well. Wanhong and Tsinghua University had a 10 megawatt version of that, pilot version that operated for a decade. So you can, in theory, maybe not good economics, but in theory you can go from 10 megawatts to on up, right? So what it would enable a company like Duke to do is instead of placing a $12 to $14 billion bet on a huge power plant, we could build 100 megawatts now and limit that financial risk, and 100 megawatts later when we need another 100 and limit that financial risk and do it more incrementally, which also corresponds. See, back when we built the existing nuclear fleet in the U.S., we were seeing 6, 7, 8% growth in electricity demand per year. So if you put on a 500 or 1,000 megawatt nuclear plant, that wasn't too bad in terms of meeting your increased demand. But today with essentially flat load growth, it makes a lot more sense. Since what we're basically doing today is, is fundamentally modernizing and decarbonizing the fleet and trying to meet very low incremental growth. It makes a whole lot more sense to build 100 megawatts than 1,200 megawatts.
Let me ask one quick question about renewable energy, and then we'll go to the questions from the group. You guys had a very public signing ceremony with Hillary Clinton back in 2011 with a Chinese company with which you were going to do something called eco-cities, developing eco-cities. That's gone fairly slowly. Just give us a bit of taste of what's going on there and why it hasn't gone the way you had expected.
Well, it's been very difficult to identify the right project that would both be doable and meaningful for all parties. And by all parties, the parties to that particular deal, the signatories to that are the city of Langfang, the city of Charlotte, ENN, a Chinese company, and Duke Energy. And then the other parties to that are the U.S. State Department, U.S. DOE.
Department of Energy.
Yes, thank you. Ministry of Science and Technology in China. So those are the parties. So trying to figure out how to do a project that's going to be doable, feasible, and satisfies all stakeholders has proven enormously difficult, as has kind of the changing dynamics of the whole thing. So we looked actually prior to the Democratic National Convention being held in Charlotte, we looked at the possibility of actually doing a small project in Charlotte with ENN that would showcase new energy technology. And it just proved to be extremely difficult for a whole number of reasons. The ones I mentioned about the difficulties with working across time zones, et cetera, but also just the pure physical issue of where do you put it, where does the city want it, what's going to make sense, who pays for it, all that kind of stuff. So it's just proven very difficult. We're still working it. We're definitely still working it, and we've got some ideas. And in fact, when I go over in June, I'm going to spend time with Dr. Zhu, who's one of my counterparts at ENN. And then I've got a team of engineers who are going over later who are going to spend more time with ENN and some other Chinese partners to try to figure out how to define that next project.
Okay, excellent. Thank you. So we're going to open this up to you guys, and we're going to give students first dibs. So why don't we do this just really informally? Why don't you guys raise your hand? If we have no questions, then David and I will have failed utterly up here for the past 45 minutes. Yes, please. Shout, because just so everyone can hear you. Thanks.
I was wondering if you could tell us what this mystery solvent is that is better than the energy.
I tried once, right? Yeah, what's the mystery solvent?
I know company secrets and stuff, but...
The specifics there are proprietary. What I can tell you is it's a cocktail of multiple solvents.
Okay.
Nice try.
Thank you.
Please, go ahead.
I don't want to take it too far away from China, but I am interested in your speaking about potential expansion to build new nuclear capacity in the United States, and what you see that future like in the short term as far as nuclear development.
Did everyone hear that?
Okay, you want to repeat? Yeah. So the question is, okay, interesting to hear about what's going on with nuclear in China, but what are the prospects in the U.S., especially near term? I get it? Okay. Near term, it's very difficult. There are a couple of projects basically underway. One is at SCANA in South Carolina, and the other is in Georgia, a Southern Company project. What's challenging today is with shale gas and the low price of natural gas, just on a pure economic basis, it is hard if you believe that gas prices are going to stay in the range where they've been trading for the last 2 years. It's really tough to justify a nuclear project. So that's the big impediment today, I think. So does that cover it for now? Okay.
Carlos.
So you mentioned that one of the biggest reasons for Duke going to China was to find new sources of capital. How has that impacted Duke's operations in China and perhaps in the United States?
Okay, well, first of all, we were successful in
You want to
sourcing.
repeat the question? Just so
Oh, okay, yeah. Tell us about how sourcing new sources of capital with China have impacted our operations in China and in the U.S. So we were successful in gaining access to Chinese capital. We have Bank of China, ICBC, and China merchants in our banking syndicate today. They're also in our credit revolver at the most senior level. Two of them are Bank of China and ICBC. And I told a little vignette earlier today. When I was in Beijing this past October, the president of China's Export-Import Bank heard through the grapevine that I was in town and tracked me down and demanded to have lunch with me in this case, because he wants in. He wants to know, okay, how can we get in your banking syndicate? But so that's been successful from that point of view. How it's impacted our operations, first I've got to clarify that we do not have operations in China. We have a rep office in China. We're fundamentally not interested in entering the Chinese market. So we're really interested in bringing things, bringing the best knowledge and technology available to the Americas to serve our customer base in the Americas. So how it's affected our operations here, I think it's done a couple of things. One is it gives me a way to talk about how the money and time we've invested in working with China has paid off. It's one of the ways it's paid off, because it now does give us access to increased diverse sources of capital. So whenever we hear, rumblings about, okay, Greece is going to default and the European Union is going to implode and who knows what's going to happen to global finance, well, we've at least got now new entities in our banking syndicate where we could source capital if other capital markets, seize up going forward. But the other thing that I would say that the capital piece has done for us is it actually has an interesting kind of knockoff effect in that now Chinese companies, big Chinese companies, some of whom we've never talked to before, say, oh, wait a minute, Bank of China is actually in your banking syndicate. That's pretty interesting. We'd like to talk to you, So it gives us more street cred.
Do you have any problems in Washington when you go to Washington and you tell people on the Hill that you have Chinese money in your syndicate? Is that a political problem at all?
It hasn't been so far, but maybe it's because they don't know about it. I don't know.
They will now. Excellent. Excellent. Other questions? So I'm going to, Matt, go ahead.
I was wondering if you can actually speak a bit more about the political scene that's happening between the U.S. and China. How involved have they been? What has been the role? We've certainly heard allusions to a lot of tensions, especially over like solar tariffs and such. Have you seen a lot of interaction, a lot of intervention?
No, that's not really, that really doesn't affect what I do very much. But I'll answer your question in a slightly different way if I can. The first time I brought Jim Rogers over to China after I'd been over in November of '08, we were actually at a U.S.-China Energy Conference in the Great Hall of the People on Tiananmen Square in Beijing. And through a weird set of circumstances, we got a private audience with a guy by the name of Zheng Guobao, who is the head of the National Energy Administration in China and the co-chair of the National Development and Reform Committee that sets all the prices in the Chinese economy. So we got 10 minutes with him, turned into half an hour, had a really good time talking to him. And he got us into all kinds of stuff in China. I mean, it was really an important contact. At the time, I didn't understand how things work in China. Now I do more. So you almost have to have that kind of sponsorship to make things work. But that was just huge. And so a part of, I guess another thing that happened, they're not directly related, but another thing that happened was we were invited to go on a trade mission to China in 2010 with then Secretary of Commerce Gary Locke. So I spent 8 16-hour days with him traveling around China, talking with all kinds of government officials and companies in China. Well, since then, I think you probably know this, he's now become U.S. ambassador to China, right? So that is more kind of, for me, how the set of relationships has worked as opposed to tariff wars and commercial disputes. It's been more of that nature.
Other questions? I'm a student, I think, maybe? Yeah, excellent. And then we'll move, then we'll broaden it. Thanks.
Sure. I was wondering, you said you aren't interested in expanding the Chinese market, and I was wondering, is that because there are legal hurdles that China throws up or political hurdles, or is it just a matter of company strategy?
It's more company strategy. I mean, we really don't have any market knowledge over there. We have no customer base over there. You know, I mean, on the most fundamental level, we're in a heavy fixed infrastructure business. And so our infrastructure is in the Americas. So to really move beyond that would be tough for a company like Duke. And not the least of which is because, you know, our shareholders are really looking for a stable, annuity-like, you know, safe utility return. So I think if we went to our shareholder base and said, hey, guess what, we're going to go into the Chinese market, we'd get, wait a minute, right? So all those are factors.
Let me just ask, are there any questions, particularly from students, that deal with the technology of coal and what works, what doesn't work, any of that? I just want to make sure that we don't skip over that if there's interest in that, given that we've talked broadly about lots of things today. Okay, excellent. Please.
So this isn't about the technology, it's more about the price. What's your speculation on the lowest price of carbon in the Americas in 2050 that would get you to zero? That would, as you plan over the next half century, if Duke wanted to be at zero, where would the price of carbon have to be?
We wanted to be at zero CO2 emissions.
Zero CO2 emissions. Just, I realize it's a little unfair question.
Yeah, it is, but I'll give you an unfair answer.
The best ones always are.
I'll give you an unfair answer. It would have to be quite high.
Meaning?
Meaning quite high.
Between 75 and 100?
Okay, so if you want to get specific, I really can't go there unless I have some time to really think about it a lot. Because it not only depends on the cost, it depends on what the relative market is, what else is going on in the market. What's the cost of solar then? What's the cost of natural gas? Do we have ways to capture carbon from natural gas that don't exist? All those things count into my answer to the question. But so the best answer I really think I can give you is zero by 2050. It would have to be quite high. Probably so high that it would have a negative impact on the U.S. economy. One man's opinion, not speaking for Duke here. Okay.
Please.
How does Duke feel about whether it would prefer cap on trade, or a strict carbon tax?
We have favored cap and trade, and for a couple of reasons. One is because we have experience with it in the SO2 arena, where it worked. It seemed to us to be quite equitable. It actually did stimulate technology development and resulted in very significant and rapid reductions in SO2. And maybe most importantly, from a Duke perspective, we felt like it was fair to our customers because the way it worked, you know, it didn't immediately penalize customers with excessive costs. And the reason we're very concerned about that is if you look at the coast, not much coal out here, not much coal in New England. In the middle of the country where we operate, a lot of coal, all right? Higher then than now, but still a lot of coal. So if you kind of turn on the switch and put this huge cost imposition on this one set of customers, one set of states, you know, one set of economic communities, you've really got some bad stuff going on there. So that's why we prefer cap and trade.
Senator Bingaman.
EPA's getting ready to finalize limits on emissions from new coal-fired power plants. Are the new coal-fired power plants being constructed in China able to meet those kinds of limits?
Did everyone hear that question? The question is, so EPA is getting ready to regulate tougher emission standards on U.S. coal-fired power plants. How do the power plants being built in China compare to that regulation being implemented in the United States?
I don't have a good definitive answer for you, but my answer would have to go like this. So China is continuing to build traditional pulverized coal plants. The answer there is no. They are also building ultra supercritical and supercritical plants. I don't clearly know the answer there. Those plants are significantly more efficient, so they might. I don't know. A plant like the GreenGen IGCC plant definitely could, because it's got capture sequestration capability. So sorry, I don't have better data in back of mind there. But.
Kareem.
So, in addition to the U.S., from the conversations that you had in China...
Can you just speak up a little bit so everyone can hear you?
From the conversations that you had in China, did you see that the Chinese partners are also interested in investing capital in other countries, or is that interest just specific to the US?
No, there's actually a going out policy in China that's been included in the past 2 5-year plans. They're very intent on increasing their outgoing investment.
So what else are they looking at?
Well, Huaneng has investments in Myanmar and Indonesia, I believe.
Europe as well, I think.
Yeah, I think you're right. State Grid just bought the grid in Portugal. So, you know, it's all over the place.
Yeah. Please. Here, I see one in here. Go ahead.
What is your breakdown at Duke of coal, gas, and other sources? And what, do you have any guess as to what it might be 20 years from now?
Okay, let me give you kind of rough numbers, and I'll do it on an energy basis as opposed to...
Just to repeat the question. The question is, what is Duke's generation mix today among fuels, and what might it be in 20 years?
Yeah. So I'll give it to you on an approximate energy basis. So we're approximately 40% coal by kilowatt hours produced. We're approximately 30% natural gas, and we're approximately 20% nuclear. Natural gas is actually flipped in the last couple of years. I would have given you different numbers a couple of years ago. And then the rest is hydro, pump storage, and renewables. How that will change going forward is, you know, it's a fool's game to make these kinds of predictions. But here's what I think will happen. I think you'll see coal become a smaller component of that mix. I think you'll see natural gas increase a little bit. And then I think that you will see renewables also increase a little bit. Mm-hmm.
Go ahead. Yeah, sorry.
How close to the 40% efficiency does the supercritical and the ultra supercritical come?
Okay, so the question was, how close to the 40% efficiency do the supercritical, ultra supercritical come? The numbers that I have in my head for supercritical are in the like 35, 36, 37% range. There may be others out in the audience who actually have better information in their heads than I do on that. The ultra supercritical can get up to 40%.
You had a question here.
Yes, scaling and systems integration. I'm wondering if it would make sense to take advantage of the Department of the Navy's experience over decades in building complex systems integration, and nuclear reactors, and they are very interested in small modular reactors.
Funny that you should mention that. We're deeply engaged in that conversation. Specifically, and there's one specific where we're engaged at a nuclear facility. So the question was, given the Navy's vast experience with small modular reactors, complex systems integration, why aren't we working with them? And my long-winded answer was, we are.
Good.
So.
Other questions? This room has been poorly represented. This side has been poorly represented. Please go ahead back there. I think we're busting our deadline here, but we'll do maybe one or two more quickly. Please.
I'm a student from China, and very interesting to hear the STARS experience you had with Huaneng.
Can you speak up a little bit just so we can hear you?
So I say I'm a student from China. It's interesting to hear the story you had in the partnership with Huaneng. And Huaneng is a household name in China. It's the largest. It's been embarrassing to say that I don't know what's the second largest. Maybe it's a fraction, but that's not the question. So I'm guessing that does Huaneng have a lot of domestic competition? And what do you think are the incentives for a company to invest and come up with better and cleaner technologies? What are the incentives?
In China?
Yes.
Okay. There are 5 GenCos in China. Huaneng is the largest. I believe that Guodian is the second. I think that Guodian is the third. I think the Tong is the fourth, and I forget the fifth, so sorry about that. The incentive to invest, as I perceive it in China, is primarily government policy driven. So I think it's almost as simple as that.
If you read the 5-year plan, the new 5-year plan, the 12th 5-year plan, it's very explicit about investing in cleaner technologies across the board, including in coal. Someone's going to have to give me the signal about when we have to cut this off definitively. One more? Okay. Go ahead, TG. Yeah.
David, you pointed out earlier, say understanding a new culture is difficult. So building another culture that will be the dream of they have a system of since 15 operating nuclear reactors now. 3-4 years is going to be about 40. So I think the nuclear safety culture is extremely critical for them and also for you and for all people in the nuclear industry. So what's your take on what is the most critical component for them to come out in more safety culture?
Well, there are a couple, I would say. The first is the way that I think you really get at good nuclear safety.
The question was basically, how does China build a culture of nuclear safety as China builds out a nuclear series of plants? Yeah.
Two things, I think, really come to bear. The first is, if you really want to get to safety, and actually it's not just nuclear safety, it's industrial safety overall, you really can't wait for an event to take place and then analyze the event. You've got to really look upstream at what are the precursors that could lead to some kind of a safety event. And the further upstream you can get, the better. So the pressure here in the U.S. is to push further and further upstream. In fact, I started my career in nuclear, actually in radiation physics, and I used to joke with people at the time that our instrumentation could measure to increments of X, right? And so the limit for that, whatever the radiation being measured, would always be X. And then we'd improve the instrumentation, and it would be 1/10 X. Guess what happened? The limit went to 1/10 X. So at the time, I thought that was, I don't know, almost wrong. Now I think maybe it was a good idea. Okay, I'm a little older and wiser. But I think the same thing applies when you just look at operating kinds of safety issues. So if there's an issue where, gee, if an operator inappropriately operates this system, and then it could have an impact, a knockoff effect on this system, and this system, and create a safety problem, you want to understand all that in a crystal clear way, and make sure that you're controlling all the way back here, not down where, some observer who weren't aware of that whole chain would say, oh, I see, this is your problem. Well, that's not your problem. If you really want to nip it in the bud, you got to be here. So that's the long-winded way of answering number one. Number two is really that cultural issue. It's with saving face, and I do perceive that as being very deeply embedded and very subtle in Chinese culture. And it's there's a guy in China. His name is Chen. I'm going to say this wrong. Chen Zemin. He was president of China Guangdong Nuclear Power Corporation. He was also the president of the World Association of Nuclear Power Operators, and he is now at CPI, China Power Investment Corp. He is one hell of a smart man, and he gets this point a lot. He also, in between China Guangdong and CPI, he did a stint at NEA. So, and he understands. I think he really understands the issues in China. And maybe you could talk to me about how you overcome that particular thing, because if you see a problem in a nuclear environment, you got to speak up, and you got to be willing to challenge authority over it. Yes,
aircraft are exactly the same kind of problem, and you might seriously consider recruiting ex-pilots, because they can't deal with this, with the face-saving kind of a thing. In fact, they elect their crew. If you see me start to do anything wrong, for God's sake, speak up.
So listen, we're going to end, but before everyone jumps out of their seat, I just want to say two things by way of housekeeping. The first is, if you want to tweet about what you've heard, tweet at the following, #StanfordRisingPower. If you tweet it #RisingPower, it's going to be confused with the AC/DC song. #StanfordRisingPower. Number two.
So your choice is what
exactly. Whatever you want to do. Number two is this is the first of 5 sessions that we're going to have in the Rising Power series on China and energy. The next one is going to look at investment, particularly at venture capital investment, with people who are playing that with offices on both sides of the Pacific. That's next Monday here. You can find out more about the series by going to the Energy Seminar website at Precourt. Thank you again very much to David Mohler for coming, and thank you to all of you.